Do you know that there's a way to sort of quantify how a city is doing on their parks?
Well, I've heard a little bit.
There's this thing called ParkScore, and I wanted to talk about that in response to you talking to us about why parks are important, how
Yeah.
we might be able to measure that, or at least one tool we can use to measure that. Sound good?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Okay, so there's an organization called the Trust for Public Land that I just love. We have a couple friends from Trust for Public
Yeah,
Land here
yeah.
locally. They operate nationally, but we've got some local offices as well. And they have a tool, the national office has a tool called ParkScore that helps cities quantify how they're doing in terms of parks. And that is measured on 5 different areas, including access, acreage, investment, amenities, and equity. So how does that resonate with you when you think about those items, when you think about parks?
Yeah, especially the amenities. I know there are some like Cleveland parks that are like just kind of like just grass, and
Yeah.
like I'd rather have a park there than like a housing development.
Sure.
But yeah, amenities is like a big thing. I hope we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to look at all of those different metrics through the lens of the number one scoring city, which is Washington, D.C.,
Yeah.
and then also through our city, which is Cleveland. And we come in at like 24 or 25. Sorry, I forgot to write that part down.
That's
we're,
okay.
we're doing pretty well.
Mid-20s.
Mid-20s, yes, if I'm remembering
I
correctly.
mean, that's pretty good.
For the
nation.
Yeah, for the nation, that's doing pretty well. We said that Cleveland Metroparks are always really highly rated. So let's first talk about access. That's their first metric. DC scores 99 out of 100 here, and Cleveland scores 74 out of 100. And access measures the portion of city residents who are within a 10-minute walk of any park.
Yeah, that accessibility is important.
Yeah. How does that strike you? How do you feel about that measure, just objectively,
A
maybe
10-minute walk?
subjectively? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like, what is that, like a quarter of a mile?
Depending on the person.
Yeah,
Sure.
I wouldn't walk more than like a quarter of a mile to a park.
Right. Right.
So I
How
think that's pretty good. Like, I think that's a fair assessment.
do you feel like the parks you use most are ones you can walk to, or are you willing to bike or drive to parks?
West Park and North Royalton, both places I've lived, they are not really walkable parks. Bikeable more in West Park, but even so, like if you don't have a good bike lane to bike there and you're on a busy road, not great. So I mean, 10 minutes of 10 minutes of walking, I think is a good measure.
Yeah. And of course, we know that that is imprecise because everybody walks at a different pace. Maybe you are a really fast walker. Maybe you have to walk with a walker, or maybe you're walking with a stroller or something. Like
Right.
they use that as their general measure. I think it is
course.
technically based on mileage or maybe an average. But that is the first measure they're looking at, is just straight up access. Are you close to a park? Then they look at acreage, and this is measuring the median park size and the percentage of the city area that's dedicated to parks. So for DC, they score a 55 out of 100 here, so they're kind of in the middle. About 24% of their land is parks.
Wow.
Cleveland scores a 32, and 7% of our land is dedicated to parks, which is interesting. 32 out of 100 isn't great, but it seems like it's not in the worst patch. So I just want to know who's scoring 1 out of 100, these cities that have no land or almost no land. If we're only dedicating 7% and we're still scoring a 32, that feels pretty wild to me. I can't imagine what city is hitting a 1 out of 100 for
I know.
acreage.
Yeah, because like 7%, I don't know. So like if I'm thinking about 10% of land, like that kind of seems like a lot of parkland to me, to be honest. Like
Really?
if I'm looking like at a map and I were to like just take like 10% of that city away and be like, yeah, that's all park.
Which for DC is 24%.
That's
so
like pretty crazy. Like a quarter?
Yeah.
Like more or less.
quarter of the city's land is dedicated to park space, which I think is incredible.
So
and
who's scoring 100 then?
I know. Well, I didn't go into that, but we definitely can. And just to be clear, this tool is publicly available, and it goes into so much depth. You can look at maps, you can plug in where you are, and it's not just big cities. I plugged in the city that I live in, which is a suburb outside of Cleveland, and that showed up, even though it's very, very small. So you can probably find your city or town on ParkScore, or at least something nearby. So we're talking about acreage, but then we also look at investment. DC scores 100 out of 100 here, and Cleveland scores 66 out of 100. And this looks at a 3-year average of public and private spending on parks, and it also monetizes volunteer hours. So
cool.
Some of this feels a little imprecise to me. It's really hard to monetize volunteer hours.
Yeah.
But you can look at public and private spending and see, essentially, is this community investing in their parks? How do you feel about that as a metric? Do you think that matters when we think about how our parks are doing?
Yeah, I would say so because, I mean, from my experience in nonprofit, if you are able to like quantify like how many volunteers how many volunteer hours you're getting, you can apply to like other grants and that opens you up for more funding.
Totally.
Stuff like that.
Yeah.
Also like Cleveland Metroparks volunteer base is like huge and people probably see that volunteering as like a way to recreate. And so
Absolutely.
I think it doesn't sound precise like you're saying, but yeah, it sounds good.
And the public and private spending is more precise, being able to look at the actual dollars here. So you talked about how Cleveland almost always passes the levy. I think always has passed the Metroparks levy.
Passed.
Which is incredible, by the way. But that also shows that we're putting our money where our mouth is, so to speak, that if we say we love these parks and we're using these parks, that we're also voting as a city to say we want those parks to be there for us, and we're willing to spend on that.
Right.
We also look at amenities, and this was the one that you said stuck out to you. DC scored 85 out of 100, and Cleveland scored 60 out of 100 for amenities. And this looks at 6 popular features that you might find in parks, things like basketball hoops, dog parks, splash pads, etc. So how does that strike you? When you think of amenities at parks, what are some of the things that you think of?
Yeah, it needs a splash pad.
Yeah, you a splash pad guy?
Yeah, I'm going to throw my Speedo on and go like running into the splash
Scare
pad.
the children. Well, Cleveland does really well on splash pads, just so you know. We score
I know.
We score really high on splash pads, so you've got plenty of room to wear your Speedo. We also score like 100 out of 100 or 99 out of 100 on basketball hoops.
Yeah.
So good for us.
Yeah,
Lots
good
of
for
places to recreate if you want to play sports. We also do pretty well on rec and senior centers, recreation centers and senior centers.
Yeah, we got a lot of old people.
We do. Any recreation center, but including senior centers.
Okay.
We do. We are an aging city. But we score horribly on dog parks. We get a 1 out of 100 on dog parks.
I don't really like those dogs anyways. I mean, dog parks are like despicable, you know?
It really depends on the dog park. I do know a lot of dog trainers who are like anti-dog park. They think it's bad for dogs. And I'm not going to make comment on that. I'll just say that it is something that people say they want. And DC gets 100 out of 100 on dog parks. Those yuppies. All they care about is their dog and their dog parks.
DC, man.
Yeah.
Wow.
The thing that stood out to me that actually surprised me on Cleveland scoring is we scored pretty low on playgrounds. So it seems like we have relatively good access to being at a park, but if you're a parent, what is your kid going to do when they get there if there's not a playground? Then maybe they can like play tag or play sports, but I was not the kind of kid who was going to like play with a basketball hoop. Oh my gosh, that required hand-eye coordination. I didn't have that. I needed just like a swing set.
Yeah.
That was that was my speed at a park growing up.
A nice book and a swing set and
you know
were
it.
set.
I'd bring my Polly Pockets outside and play in the park because my mom was like, you need to go outside. And I would be like, but I'm living in my imagination.
Yeah.
So that's...
My grandma would take me to the playground, like a playground. If she ever took us to like a park where it's just like a creek and like, I don't know, just
a little
green
culvert
space.
and
a little
nothing
culvert.
else.
Yeah, just like I got bored kind of quick. So yeah, those kids do need a playground maybe.
Yeah, so I would say from my perspective, just reading this report, maybe that's a place that Cleveland could invest more, is having more of those spaces have playgrounds. I'm not that concerned about the low dog park score, but then again, my dog would never go to a dog park. The last thing they look at is equity, which I'm really glad is included. Trust for Public Land seems to be really ahead of the game on looking at that. So DC scores an 86 out of 100 for equity, and Cleveland scores a 71 out of 100 for equity. And that's looking at the distribution of parks and park space between neighborhoods based on race and income. So they are being really intentional about saying, okay, so this percentage of your land is park space or is a 10-minute walk away, but how is that distributed? Is that all in the richest areas of your community, or is that also in your poorer areas?
Yeah.
So those are the metrics that Trust for Public Land is looking at when they create these park scores. It's a good way to kind of at a glance see how a community is doing, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about the limitations of these metrics because I think that's important to acknowledge. So we just mentioned that they are looking at equity. They are looking at how parks are distributed. But we also know that not all parks are created equal. And so I'm curious, maybe this is deep in the report, because these reports are lengthy and detailed.
Yeah.
But just in that raw score, is that considering the quality of the park? Or is it just that it's there? Because I do know that there are parks that people don't really use because they aren't well maintained, or they become places where sort of unsavory things happen. It's this public space that
unsavory.
Unsavory, yeah.
Like what kind of things, though?
Well, you might not feel safe in every park, for example.
Yeah.
That could be because of the way it's being used. But it could also be because there's like no lights there. So,
yeah, absolutely.
You know, maybe you don't feel like you can go there after dark because there's no street lights or park lights. Or maybe there's no water fountain. So you could go and play, but when it's hot, in a nice neighborhood, maybe there's a water fountain, there's those amenities so that you can stay and play and stay hydrated.
Yeah.
And then in other communities, there might not be. So I'm just curious how Trust for Public Land is considering that.
Yeah.
Whether that is included in their equity metric. It didn't appear to be.
Right.
But it might be in their narrative.
No, that's really important because I know in the city of Cleveland in Ward 16, there's a park called McGowan Park, and somebody got shot there like 4 years ago. And people just like don't visit that park anymore, even though it's a safe neighborhood. There's still that like memory of that, and people just don't visit it anymore. Yeah. So like, I don't know, it's like a park that's not being used at all. And yeah, how do they factor it in is your question.
Exactly.
You know?
I've also seen stories of, for example, gang violence or gun violence happening on basketball courts, and so they'll take down the basketball nets or take down the hoops so that kids can't use it anymore.
I'm not a fan of that.
Exactly, I'm not a fan of that either. And so maybe that park is still there, but the main amenity isn't. So you're sort of punishing that neighborhood because of some bad actors, which really just means that kids in that neighborhood don't have access to that amenity. So curious how that is factored in or not, and how it maybe could be if it's not.
Yeah.
We already talked a little bit about how a 10-minute walk is somewhat subjective. So I'm curious to know more about whether they take into account the infrastructure around that, like transportation. So maybe it's a 10-minute walk for me, but I'm not a person who can walk. So is it still walkable, quote unquote, if I'm using a wheelchair?
Right.
You know, are there impairments in the sidewalks that would make it hard if I had to use a walker or a wheelchair? Or maybe is there a way to get there by bus or other public transit if I can't walk?
Yeah. Or are you like just a kid and you're like, I don't know, you don't want to walk on the street or something. You know? Like you don't want to die like getting there, you know?
Exactly. And then the last thing I was thinking about was in that investment area where we looked at raw amount of dollars that were spent in the park system. I'm wondering if that's sort of cost of living adjusted city to city, because DC is probably going to put more money because there are like the cost of living is so much higher there that people make more money. And so that percentage of their taxes is a higher raw amount compared to something like a city of Cleveland where the median income is much lower. And so a significant proportional percentage of income might not be the same. So those are some of the limitations I just wanted to acknowledge. But now we've talked about how parks are important for local government, for businesses, for people. And also we have one tool that we can use to measure how we're doing for parks.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
I hope that people check that out, that resource out, Trust for Public Land. I'm kind of curious like what people will find on their own ParkScore. And they can use that to dialogue with their elected officials about, hey, we need this, we need that. We have too much of this, not enough splash pads, stuff like that.
Absolutely. You can also use it to dialogue with us. Tell us about your park score. Put it in the comments. That's the kind of thing we want to see.
Yeah. Well, Shelby, how about you let our viewers know about how they can stay in touch with us?
Absolutely. If you'd like to stay connected to us, be sure to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at One Planet Media. That's ONE1. And if you'd like to rewatch full episodes, check out our YouTube channel, All Things Green Show. You can find all our sources from today's episode in our show notes. And like we said, you can leave a comment and let us know how your park score went.
We'll be back at the same time next week. Thank you so much for being a part of the global sustainability movement.